In early January 2026, the United States of America launched a significant military operation against Venezuela that sent shockwaves across the world. U.S. forces carried out airstrikes and special operations in Caracas, resulting in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, who were reportedly flown to the United States to face charges including narcoterrorism. U.S. President Donald Trump publicly confirmed the operation, describing it as effective and asserting that America would oversee Venezuela until a transition could be organized, including potential involvement of major U.S. oil companies to rebuild Venezuela's struggling energy sector. Trump's remarks, and the scale of the operation, suggested a shift in U.S. foreign policy toward unilateral action without clear authorization from the United Nations or a mandate from Congress. The military raid, described by U.S. officials as Operation Absolute Resolve, involved extensive planning and the use of elite units, and was followed by reports of significant casualties, including dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban security personnel and civilians. Several U.S. service members were also reported injured during the clash. Venezuela's interim leadership, led by Vice President Delcy Rodriguez following Maduro's capture, declared a period of national mourning and vehemently rejected claims that the U.S. controls the country, insisting Venezuelan authorities remain in charge of domestic affairs. The global reaction to the U.S. action has been intense and deeply divided. Many countries and international organizations have condemned the strikes and the capture of Maduro as violations of international law and Venezuelan sovereignty. At an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, several member states, including Brazil, China, Russia, Cuba, Mexico, and others, described the U.S. military intervention as an unlawful act of aggression. The UN Human Rights Office also issued strong criticism, stating that the unilateral use of force undermines core principles of international law and sets a dangerous precedent that could weaken global stability. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres emphasized the need for restraint and peaceful resolution of differences under the framework of international law and the UN Charter. Latin American nations expressed profound concern and rejection of the military action, with leaders from countries such as Brazil and Mexico describing the strikes as crossing an unacceptable line that could destabilize the region and endanger civilians. Latin American and European stakeholders urged that the crisis be resolved through dialogue and negotiation, respecting the will of the Venezuelan people without external interference. Mexico's government highlighted the potential humanitarian impact, while Cuba's president labeled the U.S. attack as state terrorism against the Venezuelan people. Several governments called for immediate de-escalation and for international law to be upheld in addressing the Venezuelan situation. Regional responses reflected broader geopolitical tensions, with some U.S. allies expressing concern about the legality and long-term consequences of the intervention, despite recognizing the challenges posed by Venezuela's political and economic crisis. In contrast, some Venezuelan expatriate communities abroad, including in the United States and Spain, reportedly reacted to Maduro's capture with mixed emotions, with celebrations in some cities and protests in others over the unilateral U.S. action. The conflict has prompted debates within the U.S. Congress and among international legal experts regarding the scope of presidential war powers, the justification for cross-border military operations, and the role of foreign policy in addressing accusations of narcoterrorism and human rights violations. As of mid-January 2026, the situation remains highly fluid. The U.S. leadership insists that the operation aims to restore democracy and eliminate threats posed by alleged drug trafficking and criminal networks tied to the Maduro regime. Meanwhile, critics warn that the use of force without multilateral support and adherence to legal norms could further destabilize Latin America and erode global trust in international institutions. The international community continues to watch closely, with calls for an immediate ceasefire, respect for national sovereignty, and urgent diplomatic engagement to find a peaceful, negotiated way forward that addresses both security concerns and the humanitarian needs of the Venezuelan population. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela has been shaped by a complex mix of ideology, oil, power, and geopolitical rivalry, long before open confrontation or modern sanctions ever came into effect. Venezuela, a country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, once enjoyed economic prosperity and strong ties with the United States, particularly during the mid-20th century when American companies dominated Venezuela's energy sector and oil revenues fueled rapid urban development, rising living standards, and regional influence. However, this relationship began to change as inequality grew inside Venezuela, with wealth concentrated among elites while large sections of the population remained poor, creating fertile ground for political movements that promised radical change. This shift reached a turning point in 1998 with the election of Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who rose to power by criticizing U.S. influence, neoliberal economic policies, and Venezuela's traditional political class, positioning himself as a voice for the poor and marginalized. Chavez's Bolivarian revolution aimed to nationalize key industries, redistribute wealth, and assert Venezuela's independence from U.S. dominance, which immediately placed his government on a collision course with Washington. As Chavez strengthened state control over oil through PDVSA, expelled foreign executives, and aligned Venezuela with countries openly critical of U.S. foreign policy, tensions escalated, particularly after the failed 2002 coup attempt, which Chavez and his supporters blamed on U.S. backing, an accusation Washington denied but which permanently damaged trust between the two nations. Over time, Venezuela transformed from a close U.S. energy partner into a symbol of resistance against American influence in Latin America, while the United States increasingly viewed Caracas as a destabilizing actor exporting anti-U.S. ideology across the region. After Chavez's death in 2013, his successor Nicolas Maduro inherited both power and deep structural problems, including heavy dependence on oil exports, declining production, corruption, and weak institutions, all of which were further exposed when global oil prices collapsed. As Venezuela's economy spiraled into crisis, marked by hyperinflation, shortages of food and medicine, collapsing public services, and mass migration, the United States intensified pressure on Maduro's government, arguing that authoritarian practices, election irregularities, and human rights abuses justified a tougher stance. Sanctions imposed by Washington targeted Venezuelan officials, financial institutions, and eventually the oil sector itself, sharply reducing government revenue and access to international markets. While U.S. officials maintained that sanctions were designed to push political reform and restore democracy, critics argued that the measures worsened the humanitarian situation and punished ordinary citizens more than political elites. This period cemented Venezuela as a focal point in global debates over the morality and effectiveness of economic warfare, with supporters claiming sanctions were a non-violent alternative to military intervention, and opponents warning they deepened suffering and instability. Meanwhile, Maduro's government accused the United States of economic sabotage, blaming sanctions for the country's collapse and using anti-imperialist rhetoric to rally domestic support and justify tighter control over political opposition. As U.S. Venezuela relations deteriorated, the crisis took on a broader geopolitical dimension, drawing in global powers seeking influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russia and China expanded their presence through loans, oil-for-debt agreements, and diplomatic backing, viewing Venezuela as both a strategic partner and a counterweight to U.S. power near its own sphere of influence. Iran also deepened ties, providing fuel, technical assistance, and symbolic solidarity against U.S. sanctions, reinforcing Washington's concerns that Venezuela was becoming a hub for rival powers challenging American interests. For the United States, this alignment raised alarms not only about democracy and human rights but also about national security, energy stability, and regional order. Venezuela's collapse triggered one of the largest migration crises in modern Latin American history, with millions fleeing to neighboring countries and beyond, placing strain on regional governments and becoming an international humanitarian issue. This migration wave further internationalized the crisis, making Venezuela not just a domestic failure or bilateral dispute, but a global problem requiring coordinated responses. Throughout these developments, international organizations such as the United Nations repeatedly called for dialogue, urging both sides to avoid escalation and prioritize the welfare of civilians. However, efforts at mediation repeatedly stalled, undermined by mutual distrust, competing interests, and internal divisions within Venezuela's opposition. The recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaidó by the United States and several allies as interim president in 2019 marked another dramatic escalation, effectively splitting Venezuela's legitimacy on the world stage and deepening polarization inside the country. While Washington framed this move as support for constitutional order, Maduro's government and its allies condemned it as an attempted coup carried out through diplomatic and economic pressure rather than tanks and troops. This period entrenched a dangerous stalemate, a government controlling territory but lacking international recognition from key powers, and an opposition recognized abroad but unable to translate that support into real control at home. As years passed without resolution, Venezuela's crisis hardened into a long-term reality, reshaping its society, economy, and global position, while U.S. policy oscillated between pressure, limited engagement, and strategic calculation driven by energy markets and regional security concerns. By the mid-2020s, the conflict between the United States and Venezuela was no longer just about one country or one leader, but but about competing visions of global order, sovereignty, and power. It reflected a broader struggle over how far major powers can go in shaping the internal affairs of weaker states, where the line lies between pressure and intervention, and who ultimately bears the cost of geopolitical rivalry. For many Venezuelans, these abstract debates translated into daily hardship, uncertainty, and displacement, while for policymakers in Washington, Caracas became a case study in the limits of sanctions, the risks of confrontation, and the unintended consequences of prolonged conflict. This unresolved tension set the stage for more dramatic developments, as frustration mounted on all sides and the question remained unanswered: what happens when pressure fails, dialogue collapses, and the world moves from sanctions and statements toward actions with irreversible consequences?